Citizen media is really media where you have individual actors trying to play in that same space as traditional journalism. And sometimes they're doing it within a very formal, organized setting, and sometimes they're doing it in a much more amateur setting. This is a phenomenon that, for the most part, has started being documented largely in the West. And so one of the lead documenters in this space is Dan Gilmore. Dan is a colleague of mine over at Berkeley, and he has a great book called We the Media. We the Media has sort of introduced this idea that in journalism nowadays, in traditional journalism, it's a poor idea to think about just accessing an audience and treating them as an audience. You have to treat them as participants. And you have to consider them as participating in the process alongside you. Traditionally in journalism, as journalists, we tell people what's going on. What Dan's, I think, sort of key realization was that in many cases the audience is at least as knowledgeable as we are. And so we now see a lot of media properties that are actually trying to embrace this and move forward with this. One of the key ones in all of this is Oh My News. And Oh My News is a Korean news site that has attempted to make it possible for individual citizens to write what they want to write. There's add a layer to, this makes me really uncomfortable. I have a whole talk here and we're sort of doing this and no, it's okay. I just Google submit stories. But these stories actually get edited by real editors. And this is an interesting blend of citizen media models. I'm just going on. And this model has worked relatively well for Oh My News. Oh My News has actually become the fourth largest newspaper within South Korea, sort of working off of this model in one fashion or another. It's also been tried in a number of other high-tech and sort of high internet penetration countries, like Israel, where Scoop has become a very similar model. And in both cases, you have articles largely being produced by volunteers, edited by paid professionals, some sort of feedback mechanism to increase the quality, also some sort of feedback mechanism to pay for the production of this content. But we're also seeing this happen in developing nations. And my colleague referred to Oriopola. One of the projects that she's taking on, which is very exciting, is one called Mizalendo. And Mizalendo is a project designed to monitor the Kenyan parliament. It's designed to give you biographies of Kenyan parliamentarians. It's designed to give you the Hansard, which is the document of what happens in parliamentary business, and analysis of this. And it's worth thinking about who the audience is for this, because it's a little different from community media. The audience for this is a wired audience, which is largely Kenyan journalists, Kenyan expatriates who are living outside of the country, and to a certain extent the parliamentarians themselves. And in fact, we've had some success with this project, getting parliamentarians to come in and actually edit what they're doing. Some of a Thai blogger who calls herself Narlki. This is a 19-year-old, and most of her blogging is about shoes. And self-portrait notes, except that she found herself very close to the tanks in the streets during the typhoon. And for a brief period of time, she found herself committing acts of journalism. And this is a new trend, as you may not consider yourself to be a journalist, but you may find yourself in a situation where you briefly do become a journalist. And what's interesting is after about 5 days of poo blogging, she put up a statement and said, I'm sorry, international media, I'm not going to comment on this anymore. Here's the next pair of shoes that I'm probably going to buy. I was in the right place at the right time, but this isn't who I am or what I'm doing. We have other people using this media who really are long-term committed activists. This is a very dear friend of mine, Sami Bengarbia, who's a Tunisian human rights activist who can no longer get back into that country. And in sort of a wonderful love letter to his homeland where he hasn't been for 7 years, he's done a Google Maps mashup. And in this mashup, you can actually mouse over the Tunisia prison map and find who's in various secret prisons. You can see photos, you can see text, you can see video. It's a really interesting twist on all of these mashups that show you where the Starbucks are. This is the one showing you where the secret prisons are. Geographic is a PDF file that gets passed around Bahrain. And Bahrain is a tiny little island in the Persian Gulf, and land and who's on what piece of land becomes very, very important. So you have a village here, which is significantly smaller than the palace that it's next to. Because you can't get into the palace if you live in that village. It's very, very hard to actually see that land usage. But when you see it from the sort of God's eye satellite view, some of these issues become very clear. You start asking questions like, why is Bahrain spending tax dollars to reclaim more land from the sea by dumping garbage in the sea and building on top of it? Actually, couldn't we reallocate the land differently? This gets sent around as an email attachment. It was so radical that Bahrain started blocking Google Maps as a response. And one of the things that you have to understand is that censorship is the sincerest form of flattery. You know that your work is pissing people off and it's getting censored. Here is a trend that unfortunately we're seeing too much of, but it's a very interesting trend. This is prison blogging. One of our speakers was referring to Alec Abdel-Fattah, as a good friend of mine. This is Alec blogging from prison. And the key to blogging from prison, just for any of you who are planning on this in the future, is to make sure that your spouse blogs as well. I am lucky enough to have a blogging spouse. It's a very, very good idea, because if you're in this situation, you can write on paper, pass it out. She's able to scan and put it in. Alep's blog actually became far more trafficked while he was in prison than when he was out of prison. And so it's an interesting idea in that traditionally prison is how we silence voices. It's one of the things that repressive governments do, and this is a way to actually make it clear that you can't pay this back. We're trying to amplify these voices and make them visible to a larger audience. In some cases, what we have to do is contextualize. So this is a gentleman named Monem, who is the leading Muslim Brotherhood blogger. And he's in prison right now, and it actually requires a lot of time to explain the different campaigns in Egypt right now. One to free Kareem, who is an anti-Islamic blogger who has been sentenced to 4 years in prison for what he's written on his blog, which is shameful. Shameful that he's been sentenced to 4 years, not shameful. It should be very clear, this is a long day. Monem is now being indefinitely detained based on his work organizing for the Muslim Brotherhood on blogs. And it's been interesting, while there's been a global movement to free Kareem, there hasn't yet been one to free Monem, and this is the subject of sort of some of the context that we're trying to put on this. In many cases, and so that's one of the jobs that we do, is literally translating, in this case, some comments of Chinese bloggers on whether George Bush are from the Chinese government, and why Bush hasn't given it back for various industrial disasters that have happened in China. Here are some thoughts from the Arab world on the Virginia Tech massacre. And this ended up being translated from Arabic into English for a wider audience, and then translated further into French by one of our translators. I was about to show a slide over here about our Bangla language site. So these aren't just Romani languages. In fact, our most active is Chinese, but Bangla is one of our leading ones. The whole theory behind this is what the Yazid campaign, which is a Tunisian free speech campaign, and get it out to a much larger audience, and then make it possible to get it out to an audience in the blogosphere or perhaps in mainstream media. So I like to show people two maps, and this is a very depressing map. This is Freedom House's map of world press freedom. And the countries that are in green are considered comparatively free by Freedom House. The countries that are in purple most emphatically aren't, and the countries that are in yellow are in between. Because the press has been so restrained in so many countries, you've seen people flocking into this new medium as a potentially more open space. But that's changing, and it's changing really, really quickly. This is a project run by colleagues of mine at the Berkman Center called the Open Net Initiative. And this looks at countries where there's substantial or less substantial or event-based, which is to say temporary net filtering. My colleagues over there, 5 years ago, were looking at 4 countries that were regularly filtering large chunks of the net. They're now watching 40, and they've confirmed that 24 are fairly regularly providing some extent of net filtering. And there are concentrations in the North Africa and the Middle East and in Southeast Asia. But there are also exceptions. Ethiopia, unfortunately, has become one of the worst censors in the net in recent years. It's our observation that in really repressive nations, in really tight nations, there's no space at all to use these tools. In Burma, North Korea, Turkmenistan, no one's using them at all. You'd be afraid to use them even if you had access to them. In countries that are not especially repressive, Ghana, South Africa, there's not necessarily people flocking to these tools because there's other ways to speak. You can use community radio, you can access the local press. It's in the quote-unquote moderately repressive nations, China, Iran, Zimbabwe, Egypt, where you see people using citizen media because it may be the only form of media that they're able to access. But we're seeing it shut down. We've seen the Muslim Brotherhood website blocked. You can't see it from within Egypt. We've seen Nazareth, which is a major opposition site in Ethiopia, blocked. You can no longer access it from within the country. Ethiopia has gone further and is actually blocking Blogspot. So all 15 million plus blogs there are inaccessible if you're in Ethiopia. And there's more subtle ways to do this as well. This is a piece of research done by my colleague Rebecca McKinnon. When MSN launched their Spaces service in China, she did a wonderful experiment. This is a Microsoft server. This is actually located in the US, not in China, but it's a Chinese language product. And what it says is, please type a name for your blog. She typed in, I love freedom of speech, human rights, and democracy. And the error message she got back says, you must enter a title for your space. The title must not contain prohibited language such as profanity. Please type a different title. So freedom of speech, human rights, and democracy, you can work out the profanity in that one. Our basic hypothesis about the citizen media space is that the level of offline censorship that you see in a country multiplied by the net penetration basically gives you a good sense of the online censorship. Ethiopia has become an incredibly repressive press space. You have an incitement to genocide based on things that they're doing online. In China, we're seeing this offline censorship come into play as net penetration gets quite high, and this becomes a real threat. There are other countries like Eritrea that are incredibly repressive, but have so few net users that you actually haven't seen the online censorship come into place here. So there's possible responses to this. One is to make it possible for people to protect themselves when they use the space. This is, she was blogging from a refugee camp in Darfur, and if her identity was known, she would probably have lost her job there, lost her ability to be in Sudan. It's quite possible that the group that she was with might have lost their ability to be in Sudan, and at the point she was doing this, that was a real issue. But by finding a way for her to blog quite anonymously from within Sudan, she was able to give some really unique perspectives. And in fact, Nick Kristof, who's very interested in these issues, finally asked for help in finding her identity and was able to meet with her and amplify some of the things that she was saying on her blog and get them to the New York Times audience. Reporters Without Borders, which is one of the groups that's most active in this space, has put together a handbook for bloggers and cyber dissidents, trying to find ways that we can protect this as an open space. And we're seeing really fun techniques emerge. Isaac Mao, who is one of the leading bloggers in China and who is a frequent target of censorship, when his blog is blocked, he immediately now sends you over to a blog called notisaacmao.com. So if you can't find Isaac Mao, you will find Not Isaac Mao. It's very, very important that we have people around the world sticking up for people who are not able to exercise their rights in this space. And so the fact that creating a space of a 4-year Senate is absolutely unacceptable, and there needs to be pressure on the Egyptian government to make it very, very clear that this can't be a response to open speech. But we are very clear how long he's going to be facing persecution for what he's written in this space. So I want to leave us with a question, which is to say that today's net connects about 1 billion people. It's nowhere near as thorough as community radio. It's nowhere near as thorough as the print medium, but it's growing incredibly fast. And by the time it's used by the next 1 billion people, or the 3rd billion people, how open is it going to be? Are we going to see that map converge, the press freedom map converging with that net filtering map? Or are we going to see people actually taking stands and ensuring that this does remain a comparatively open, comparatively free space for expression? And pardon me for the technical.
The thing today is the fact that